Hey everyone, David here. Today I'm sharing a story about what happened when a tenured liberal professor decided to publicly challenge Senator JD Vance during a campus speech. What she didn't realize was that Vance wasn't just prepared for her questions, he had a personal connection to her research that would leave the entire auditorium speechless. Stay tuned to see how this professor's attempt to discredit Vance backfired in the most unexpected way. The Princeton University auditorium hummed with anticipation. The polished wood panels reflected the warm glow of overhead lights, while the scent of old books and leather seats permeated the air. Students and faculty members shuffled in their seats, the whispers and occasional nervous laughter bouncing off the vaulted ceiling. The tension was almost palpable, hanging in the room like a physical presence. But before I get deeper into this incredible story, if you're enjoying this content, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our future videos. And drop a comment letting us know what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. On the stage stood Senator JD Vance, dressed in a simple navy suit with no tie, his posture relaxed yet commanding. He had been invited to speak about economic policy and his journey from Appalachian poverty to the United States Senate, a controversial invitation that had sparked protests across campus for weeks. Campus security stood discreetly at each entrance, their eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of disruption. In the third row, Dr. Eleanor Harrington sat with perfect posture, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun, fingers tapping methodically against her leather-bound notebook. As the head of Princeton's Department of Socioeconomic Studies, she had publicly opposed Vance's invitation in a scathing op-ed, calling his views a dangerous romanticization of rural poverty. She had spent the last 30 years building her reputation as one of the nation's foremost scholars on class mobility, with her groundbreaking work, Structural Barriers to Advancement, cited in over 400 academic papers. What no one in that auditorium knew was that 2 weeks earlier, Dr. Harrington had submitted a grant proposal for a multi-million-dollar research project that was now sitting on a Senate committee desk, a committee that included Senator Vance. The professor wasn't just attending out of academic interest. She was there to publicly challenge a man who held significant influence over her professional future. But she believed her academic credentials provided sufficient armor against any potential repercussions. "Thank you for having me today," Vance began, his voice carrying that distinctive Midwestern cadence that somehow managed to sound both humble and authoritative. "I know my presence here isn't without controversy. Some might say a guy who grew up thinking that the height of luxury was having milk with his cereal doesn't belong at Princeton." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the audience. Behind Vance, a large screen displayed a black and white photo of Middletown, Ohio. Rusted factory gates, boarded storefronts, and streets eerily devoid of life. "This was my hometown when I was growing up. Today I want to talk about the economic realities that shape communities like this, and why policy discussions in places like Princeton often miss the mark." For the next 20 minutes, Vance spoke about economic policies, the decline of manufacturing, and the complex interplay of globalization and technological change. His words were measured, thoughtful, occasionally punctuated with personal anecdotes that brought the statistical realities to life. Some students nodded along, others furiously typed notes, while a few openly rolled their eyes. Dr. Harrington watched with growing impatience, her pen occasionally scratching sharp notes in her notebook. The moderator, a nervous young political science professor, finally announced the Q&A portion. Dr. Harrington's hand shot up immediately, and the moderator, recognizing the department head, quickly passed her the microphone. She rose slowly, commanding the room's attention. "Senator Vance," she began, her voice crisp with that particular tone, academics perfect over decades of lectures. "I've read your book and followed your political career with great interest." The pause that followed made it clear that interest wasn't meant as a compliment. "In your memoir and your policy positions, you've consistently emphasized personal responsibility and bootstrapping narratives while downplaying systemic barriers. How do you reconcile this position with the overwhelming empirical evidence from longitudinal studies showing that social mobility is primarily determined by structural factors beyond individual control?" The question hung in the air. Several students nodded approvingly, looking between the professor and the senator with anticipation. Vance stood motionless for a moment, taking a slow sip of water. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. That's an excellent question, Professor Harrington, he finally replied, a subtle emphasis on her title that didn't go unnoticed. I'm familiar with your work, particularly your 2018 paper on intergenerational poverty cycles. Dr. Harrington's expression flickered with surprise. She hadn't expected him to be familiar with her academic publications. In fact, Vance continued, your research on the Rust Belt communities is cited in several policy briefs I've reviewed recently. He set down his water glass and stepped closer to the edge of the stage. But I'd like to challenge the premise of your question. The room grew quieter still. Even the students who had been scrolling through their phones looked up. You've presented a false dichotomy between personal responsibility and structural factors. Both exist simultaneously. His voice remained measured, but there was a new intensity in his eyes. The systemic barriers you study are real. I've lived them, but your research misses something critical. Dr. Harrington stiffened, her knuckles whitening around the microphone. This wasn't how this exchange was supposed to go. She was the expert here, the one with decades of peer-reviewed research behind her. Your most recent study analyzed data from 200 families across 15 Rust Belt communities, correct? Vance asked. 212 families, to be precise, she answered, a hint of defensiveness creeping into her voice. Vance nodded. And how many of those communities did you visit personally during your research? The auditorium was absolutely silent now. Dr. Harrington's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. My team handled the field research component, she finally replied. Methodological best practices don't require the principal investigator to... None, Vance interrupted gently. According to your methodology section, all your primary data came from surveys administered by graduate assistants, while you analyzed the results from your office here at Princeton. A murmur rippled through the audience. Dr. Harrington's face flushed slightly. Professor, I grew up in a house where sometimes the water got shut off, where dinner might be a mustard sandwich, where my neighbors turned to opioids not because they lacked information about the dangers, but because physical pain was easier to bear than the psychological pain of watching your entire community, your entire way of life disappear. His voice never raised, but somehow it seemed to fill every corner of the room. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the theoretical discussions from their privileged classrooms suddenly colliding with the embodied reality standing before them. Your research identifies the structural barriers perfectly. What it misses is the human element, how people navigate those barriers, how culture and personal choices interact with those structures. Both matter. Dr. Harrington's academic composure was cracking. This wasn't the political hack she had expected to easily outmaneuver with her academic credentials. With respect, Senator, she said, her voice less steady now. Anecdotal experiences, even your own, don't override data-driven conclusions. Vance smiled slightly. I agree completely, which is why I'd like to share some data of my own. He turned to the screen behind him, which now displayed a map of Ohio with several counties highlighted. These are the counties you studied in your 2018 paper. Dr. Harrington's eyes narrowed. How did he have this information so readily available? 3 months ago, Vance continued, I visited every single one of these communities personally, not as a senator, not for a photo op, but to do something your research team never did. Listen to the people who live there. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a series of photographs. Vance sitting at kitchen tables, in community centers, in church basements, talking with ordinary people. I spoke with 78 families, a smaller sample than yours, I admit, but I asked them something your surveys didn't. What do you need to thrive? Another click, another slide, this one showing a word cloud. The largest words were dignity, opportunity, and recognition. Not a single person asked for more government programs. They asked for jobs that let them contribute meaningfully. They asked for educational opportunities that don't require leaving their communities permanently. They asked for policies that recognize their communities as having value beyond economic output. The auditorium was completely still. Even those who had come prepared to disagree with Vance were listening intently. And that brings me to your grant proposal, Professor. Dr. Harrington froze. How could he possibly know about that? The Senate Committee on Economic Development received your proposal for a $4.3 million study on interventional approaches to Rust Belt decline 2 weeks ago. It's an impressive proposal with solid methodology. He paused, looking directly at Dr. Harrington. But it proposes studying these communities for 3 more years before making any policy recommendations. The people I spoke with don't have 3 more years to wait while academics debate the theoretical underpinnings of their struggles. Dr. Harrington's professional reputation was unraveling before her eyes. Not because Vance was attacking her research, he had actually praised its technical merits, but because he was exposing a fundamental disconnect between her approach and the lived realities of her research subjects. Senator, she began, her voice now barely controlled, you're manipulating emotional responses for political gain. These are complex issues that require rigorous. They are complex, Vance agreed. Too complex to be understood solely through data points collected by graduate students who spend a few hours in these communities. Too complex to be solved by policies designed by people who've never experienced the problems they're trying to fix. He looked around the auditorium, making eye contact with students. Many of you will go on to positions of influence in government, in business, in academia. You'll design policies and programs that affect communities like mine. I'm not asking you to agree with my politics. I'm asking you to recognize the limits of studying human communities as abstract problems rather than places where real people live. Turning back to Dr. Harrington, he continued more gently. Professor, your research is valuable. But it would be more valuable if it incorporated the voices and perspectives of the people you study as collaborators rather than subjects. The silence that followed was profound. Dr. Harrington stood motionless, the microphone still clutched in her hand. She had come prepared for a political debate, armed with data and academic authority. Instead, she found herself confronted with something much more challenging, a fundamental questioning of the gap between her research methods and the communities she claimed to help. What happened next surprised everyone. Dr. Harrington slowly lowered the microphone and said, with a humility that few had ever heard from the famously confident professor, perhaps we have things to learn from each other, Senator. The tension in the room dissolved into murmurs of surprise. No one had expected this outcome, least of all Dr. Harrington herself. I believe we do, Vance replied. Then addressing the entire audience, he added, this is what real dialogue looks like. Not scoring points, not proving who's right, but recognizing that complex problems require multiple perspectives, including, most importantly, the perspectives of those most affected. As the event concluded, something remarkable happened. Instead of the expected battle lines being drawn more deeply, a new space had opened up. Students who had come ready to protest found themselves reconsidering their assumptions. Faculty members who had dismissed Vance as merely a politician with a compelling biography were now engaged in thoughtful discussions about research methodologies and community engagement. Dr. Harrington approached Vance as he was gathering his notes. The two spoke quietly for several minutes, their conversation hidden from the audience. What wasn't hidden was the business card they exchanged and the handshake that followed. 2 months later, Senator Vance announced a new initiative, a collaborative research program that would pair academic researchers with community members from struggling regions to develop policy recommendations together. The first academic partner in this program? Dr. Eleanor Harrington, whose revised grant proposal now included significant community participation components and a commitment to spending at least 1 week per month living in the communities she studied. When interviewed about this unexpected collaboration, Dr. Harrington admitted, I spent decades studying economic hardship without truly understanding how it's experienced. Senator Vance didn't just challenge my research methods that day, he challenged me to reconnect academic work with the people it's meant to serve. The Princeton event didn't end with a political victory for either the right or the left. It ended with something much rarer and more valuable, a recognition that the complex problems facing America require breaking down the barriers between academic expertise and lived experience, between policy discussions and the people those policies affect. True change, it seems, doesn't begin with having all the right answers. It begins with being willing to ask better questions and being humble enough to learn from unexpected sources. Hey everyone, this is David again. I hope this story gave you something to think about, regardless of your political views. Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we're willing to move beyond our predetermined narratives and really listen to perspectives different from our own. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content that explores these complex intersections of politics, society, and human experience. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What unexpected perspective has changed your thinking recently? See you in the next video.